So after 2001, the film wasn't a big success on its initial release, but they then did a second release a few months later, and it became a smash. And late '68 into '69, the film's a worldwide smash. It goes on to be nominated for a number of Academy Awards. And then Kubrick's looking for his next project, and he stays in science fiction, but it's in a completely different way. I would cautiously use the word utopia to describe the setting of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's very much a positive view of the near future in 2001. And his next film is in 1971 is A Clockwork Orange, adapted from the Anthony Burgess novel. And this is a dystopia of the near future. So it's not post-apocalyptic. It's kind of I would describe the world of Clockwork Orange as a kind of neglected society of the near future. Things are looking shabby. Things are looking run down. There's nothing positive replacing the things that have gone before. It's a very violent film. So it's about gangs of teenagers who use violence without thought, without any thinking of what the ramifications will be. And you have these wild, uncontrollable youth gangs in the film. And the protagonist then goes through this journey where he's with this violent gang, and he's using sex, just casual sex with supposedly underage girls without thinking, and he is increasingly becoming alienated from his parents and from polite society. And his journey goes from that to being ostracized by his group to being incarcerated and then reprogrammed to be a better member of society, of an increasingly authoritarian state. So it's got a lot to say in the film. Now, this is again I think must see on the Kubrick canon. Unlike the quality of filmmaking is still excellent in Clockwork Orange, but in terms of special effects, Kubrick's gone from the immaculate presentation of special effects in 2001 to sometimes being a bit slapdash. So there's a scene where they're all in a sports car and it's obvious back projection. And it looks fake, but I think nothing about a Kubrick film is accidental. He wants it to look fake because I think he is trying to give us a subjective point of view from the point of view of the characters, that they've stolen this sports car, and it's just their imagination of how it would look, because they're just absolutely they drink milk with drugs in it, things like that. So one of the controversies of Clockwork Orange, I mean, the clutching pearls, outraged housewives protested about Clockwork Orange, and Kubrick was worried about the effect it would have on the youth of the early 70s. So he famously banned his own film after its release in late 1971. He banned it himself, and he refused to let Clockwork Orange be shown in the United Kingdom until after his death in 1999. So you couldn't see it for many years. It was a film that you would have to get like a cheap downgraded VHS copy from France and read English subtitles because all the characters were dubbed into French. That was the way I saw it for the first time in the 1980s. But now it's widely available for viewing, and a good thing that is too. So there's another little gap in his career. In 1975, he releases Barry Lyndon. This is a complete change of tack for Kubrick. He's now doing a classic British costume drama, adapted from the Thackeray novel. So it's set in the mid-18th century, at the time of the 7 Years' War, and you don't get a lot of films about the 7 Years' War. So this marks it out as something special. So it's Kubrick doing English costume drama, and again, it's the visuals that sell Barry Lyndon. He decides that he's going to make the film look like contemporary paintings of the era. So he's looking, in real life, he was looking at the paintings of Hogarth, paintings of Gainsborough, Joshua Reynolds, these kind of the giants of English painting in the 18th century, and he makes the film look like that. Still with that crisp sharpness of detail, but the composition of the shots gives it this artistic look. The lead actress in the film, played by Marissa Berenson, does look like she's just stepped out of a Gainsborough painting. But there are other scenes that look like, particularly crowd scenes, scenes with large groups of people, look like a Hogarth painting. Now, one of the stories that emerges from the filming of Barry Lyndon is that he wanted to light interior scenes using only the kind of lighting they would have had in the mid-18th century, which means candle power. But of course, most film stocks or cameras can't get enough light. You can't film things purely through candle power. That's why you have all these artificial lights, and you can dim them. You can make artificial lights look a little bit like something has been lit by candles, but you can't actually use candles to light a film until Stanley Kubrick came along. He took a lens that was developed for NASA space satellites that were capable of photographing things with very low levels of light, lit only by stars light years away. Took that lens and adapted it for a 70mm film camera. And the result is he can light interior scenes with candles. And it looks amazing. It looks absolutely amazing. So this should be the masterpiece of Kubrick's career, but for many years it was ignored. And I think that's because Thackeray's novel is not... it's engaging on one level, because it is the story of an ambitious young Irishman trying to seek advantage and status in the times he lives in. But it's not a very likable story. It's not a very likable protagonist. A lot of supporting characters aren't particularly likable either. And there is a reason why, a lot of contemporary novels have been adapted over and over again, say by the BBC. And yet Barry Lyndon is one that's hardly ever touched. Kubrick did it. And it's the same here. The lead character, played very well by Ryan O'Neal, who at that stage was viewed as a soap opera star, a pretty boy actor, adept at light romantic comedies, and putting him into a British costume drama. It works. You're like, this is Ryan O'Neal. What's he doing in this film? But it works. But in the end, Barry Lyndon himself is not a particularly likable character, and it took a long time for people to grow to like Barry Lyndon. Again, it's a film that's not in a hurry to get to its destination, but boy, the set pieces in it, the use of classical music in it as well is fantastic. So do check that one out. But it's not essential Kubrick, but it's, if you want to go beyond essential Kubrick, that's the next one you should watch. Another gap, so we get to 1979 now. Kubrick does horror in The Shining. Okay, this is an iconic film. This, again, is the one, if you like horror films, you like psychological horror films as well, The Shining should be up there on your list. And commercially, it's one of his most successful films ever, The Shining. He's got Jack Nicholson on top for him. It's a very small cast. The premise is that a frustrated writer and his family look after a tourist hotel in a remote part of America that is that shuts down over the winter months, and he just goes there to look after the place, make sure nobody robs it or the place falls down in the absence of everybody else. So he's kind of like a caretaker, but he uses his spare time to write, and he goes mad because there's kind of dark, sinister forces, or are there? But anyway, the character goes mad. It introduces a lot of tropes that have become familiar to the point of parody over the years, like creepy twin sisters that appear from nowhere. It was the first film to use Steadicam, so that's the device a cameraman might wear that gives the camera a kind of floating movement that you can sort of float around, go around corners, smooth. We become used to Steadicam so much, but The Shining was the first one where it was used. It's got the famous line, "Here's Johnny." And this is, as I said, if you like horror films, particularly like psychological horror films, The Shining is definitely one. In terms of like profundity of Kubrick's work, because a lot of his films are very thinking films, metaphysical. Perhaps this one hasn't got as much as. It's got a lot of motifs, got a lot of hidden subtext to it, but I think it's more accessible than a lot of others. It's more accessible than 2001 or Barry Lyndon or Clockwork Orange for that matter. So yeah, that's on the essential Kubrick viewing list. So into the 80s, he only does one film in the 1980s, and that's Full Metal Jacket, 1987. And this comes at a period in the late 80s where there's a clutch of Vietnam War films being made. It becomes very trendy for studios to release a Vietnam War film. It started with Platoon the year previously, and in the same year as Full Metal Jacket, we had Hamburger Hill, which I think is a very underrated film, worth checking out. You get things like The Iron Triangle as well, Casualties of War. But Full Metal Jacket, I think, has stood the test of time better than a lot of the other ones are. It's a film of two halves. The first half is about a bunch of new recruits being trained as US Marines. And this introduces the iconic performance of Arlie Ermey as Gunny Sergeant Hartman, who is the ultimate example of the borderline psychotic drill sergeant, constantly berating the recruits, constantly humiliating them. There's no personality to the man. He just is this shouting machine. He's got some great one-liners, great put-downs as well. But you never get the sense of what is this character like when he's not doing this kind of performance piece in berating, humiliating, and just grinding any soul and personality out of these recruits to make them into effective US Marines. Although it's debatable whether he makes them effective US Marines, and I'll get to the second half of the film in a second. So this is an iconic performance. You've got Vincent D'Onofrio doing a kind of career-defining role as an incompetent recruit. And I won't give any spoilers away. But the first half of the film has this tone. Second half of the film, the Marine recruits are now in Hue, in Vietnam. Interestingly, because Kubrick had a fear of flying and he didn't refuse to leave the United Kingdom or go very far from it, and nothing involving air travel whatsoever, he didn't film it in a tropical area like you would expect most Vietnam War films to be made. He instead shot the entire film in the United Kingdom. So the Essex marshes become paddy fields, and he filmed it at a time when the whole of the London Docklands was being torn down and being rebuilt into the kind of shiny second financial district of London. So he was actually using the kind of half destroyed, half demolished buildings as a backdrop to for Hue, which was a large Vietnamese city that was similarly half destroyed in the Vietnam War. It gives it a kind of strange look because on the one hand, none of the buildings and none of the Essex marshes look different from what the real locations in Vietnam were, but the sky looks that just that little bit overcast. It doesn't look tropical, put it that way. It has a slight overcast look to it. But hats off to the production team in trying to make the East End of London and Essex look like Vietnam. Second half of the film, they're in Vietnam and there's fighting. And I think one of the things is that the recruits have the when they're Marines, they have the aggression and they have the kind of fighting spirit, but do they have the judgment? They're put into these situations in the second half of the film, and do they cope as well because they've had that capacity for individual thought and judgment sort of destroyed in them. It's, but again, it's a huge success for Kubrick. I'd put that top of the. So if I say Doctor Strangelove, 2001, and The Shining, definitive Kubrick, must see. I'd put Full Metal Jacket, Clockwork Orange, and Paths of Glory as the next three you should see. So, okay, moving on. Finally, his last film, released in 1999, is Eyes Wide Shut. And it's not the best way for Kubrick to end his career. It's a good film, don't get me wrong, but it's not a masterpiece. We've seen the heights Kubrick touched elsewhere in his career. Eyes Wide Shut doesn't quite match that for a couple of reasons. Not that I think his powers as a filmmaker were waning. I think his powers as a filmmaker were up there. But first of all, the subject matter. The film is about a married couple who are psychiatrists, who are having a troubled sex life, and decide to explore other options. Okay, so he's looking at kind of the sexual dynamic and sexual politics in relationships. And I don't think it's ever quite developed well. I think a lot of the problem is with the two leads, so that's Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman acting together when they were still married. But the marriage in real life was unraveling, and it kind of shows on camera as well. Kubrick's method of doing about 70 takes for each shot is perhaps not best when doing a film about sexual politics, where emotions need to be rawer and more sharp. So everybody kind of comes off as kind of cold and detached. In some scenes in Eyes Wide Shut, this works to convey that sense of emotional detachment between the two main protagonists. But elsewhere in the film, it needs a little bit more rawness to it, and it's just not there. There's stuff where Tom Cruise's character then gets involved in a kind of high-class metropolitan elite sex cult, which has kind of satanic overtones to it. Very weird. Never really explained. The resolution to that plot line never quite holds together. Not really a great supporting cast either. It's very reliant on Cruise and Kidman, and they're just not bringing. Neither of them are bringing their A game to this project. So Eyes Wide Shut is still technically a good film, still worth it as a view, but it's not the top of his game. Anyway, sadly, Kubrick died at the age of 70 in 1999. He left one unfinished project. He probably left a lot more unfinished projects, but there was one that he was particularly keen on, which was AI, artificial intelligence. And he was collaborating with Steven Spielberg. They were friends and they chatted a lot, met up a lot, and discussed this project, perhaps doing it as a joint venture. Kubrick died and left what had been developed to Spielberg, who then completed the project. I'm not a big fan of AI, but you can see the hand of Kubrick in it. You can see Kubrick's influences in it. So, let's summarize. Why is Stanley Kubrick important to watch? Because he is an iconic filmmaker. His name gets referenced. And because, as I said, this pioneering filmmaking technique that he had, the artistic quality of his films, and the fact that there's not a bad film in his back catalogue. I mean, I have been critical of Lolita and Eyes Wide Shut. Having said that, they're still excellent films, top quality. And it's worth checking out because so many people revere Stanley Kubrick. You've got to really know, if you're into films, you've really got to know who he is. And then see where his influences have gone, where it's led to. And perhaps because his films are such high quality, you should hold other commercial films to pretty much that same standard. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you later.